The year was 1961. Barney Hill was 39 years old and his wife, Betty Hill, was 42. Barney worked for the postal service. Betty was a social worker, and they had a dog named Delzy. At first, they might sound like a completely normal American couple, but they were a little more than that. Barney and Betty were an interracial couple at the time when it was still a controversial thing in America, and thus were involved with the civil rights organizations. Their lives couldn't have been easy. Like everyone else, they surely experienced their challenges and obstacles, but they were happy. Barney and Betty were in a happy, healthy, loving marriage. In fact, after Barney sadly passed away in 1868, Betty never married again, even though she died in 2004. So then, what makes this couple an extraordinary subject worthy of studying and sharing their story? Everything started in September of 1961, during a vacation the Hills took to Niagara Falls and Montreal. Their time in Canada was enjoyable and unremarkable. The real problems started on their way back home. The Hills lived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and they had to drive for a few hours to return from their vacation. Nothing about that journey should have been uncommon or unsurprising. It should have just been Barney, Betty, and their small dog, in their 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, driving safely back home. But it seemed they had company. The roads were deserted, actually. They weren't paying too much attention to the fact that they were so alone. Yet. Until something happened. Something changed in the sky, and Betty was the first to see it. Was it a falling star? Was it a plane? Was it an optical illusion? Betty couldn't know for sure. All she knew at that moment was that up there in the sky under the moon, she caught sight of a strange and unexplainable light. She could have ignored it, if not for the fact that the mysterious light was moving upward. In fact, she did try to ignore it. But maybe it was fate. Maybe it was bad luck or bad choice. The point is that she couldn't ignore the pressing feeling in her chest. Her curiosity, a spark of anxiety, the need to figure out what was hanging above their heads. Betty told her husband what she was seeing up in the sky, and she prompted Barney to park the car so they could take a closer look. Barney agreed, deciding it was also a good chance to let their dog, Delzy, take a walk. It just so happened that the small Dachshund was even more nervous than Betty. It was shifting restlessly and whining for no apparent reason. They had just passed Lancaster and stopped the car just after Twin Mountain in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. The Hills took the opportunity to pick up their binoculars and observe whatever that light was that was hovering in the sky. Betty studied its odd shape, and she started to worry when she noticed multicolored lights flickering from the object in the sky over the face of the moon. This immediately reminded her that her sister, years ago, claimed she had stopped a flying saucer in the sky. A classic UFO story. Betty started to worry and passed the binoculars to her husband. Barney didn't want to dismiss his wife's observations. He wanted to be kind and respectful, but he thought he had to be reasonable. He couldn't laugh in her face, but he wanted to be logical and objective. He tried his best, but a plane. Surely it was a plane. Through the binoculars, he watched an unfamiliar object flying over the night sky, and he told himself it simply had to be a plane. He couldn't believe anything else. He had to keep his feet on the ground, but when the object flying above them took a sharp turn, something he'd never seen a plane do before, and started speeding, seemingly directly towards them, Barney couldn't uphold his rational thinking anymore. That thing, whatever it was most definitely not a plane. Barney decided with urgency and fear that he hadn't expected at all, that they needed to get away and they needed to hide from that thing as fast as possible. They made their way toward the Franconian Notch, painfully aware of how desolated the road was. They were all alone with that bizarre object still flying in the dark sky above them. Barney tried to keep calm. He tried to be strong for his wife, but neither of them could contain their apprehension. The thing was coming closer and closer. Everything around them felt colder, darker, and emptier. They felt like they were never going to reach civilization again. They weren't so wrong to assume that, because suddenly, everything would change for Barney and Betty Hill. The extraordinary flying object dropped from the sky at a ridiculous speed. Just when Barney and Betty reached for each other, sure that this monstrosity was about to crash on top of them, the object stopped. It floated about 100 feet above them, perfectly still and unbothered by gravity. It loomed over the hill's small car, like a dark sign from the end times. It filled the entire view of the windshield. It was all they could see. It separated them from the rest of the world. Despite the erratic beat of their hearts, Barney nearly laughed when he thought of comparing that thing with a pancake. It was an insane situation. He had no idea how to react. They were both at a loss for words. The fear in Barney and Betty's heart was immeasurable, but there was no option to do anything. Barney knew he had to act. His only protection was the pistol he carried in his pocket. He refused to think about how insignificant it was compared to the giant phenomenon hovering above him. He told his wife to wait in the car, and he grabbed the binoculars again. This time, Barney saw a sight terrible enough to paralyze the heart of weaker men. With a trembling hand, he held the binoculars to his eyes and looked up at the top of the odd craft ahead of him. It was absurdly different from a plane, but that was all Barney had to compare it to. From the front of that incredible vessel, Barney saw a series of windows, and, shockingly, he spotted human-like figures standing on the other side of them. He tried to count them, but his terror in their movements made him lose count somewhere around 10. This was already so much more than what Barney thought was possible, let alone what he thought he'd experience in his life. But it was about to turn much, much worse. All at once, the creatures moved in a synchronized manner towards one specific spot in their flying craft. All except one. One humanoid figure, a mysterious and menacing silhouette. It stood in front of the windows, facing the road between them, leaning toward the Hills' car. And it took Barney a minute to realize it, but the creature was staring directly at him. He wished he could move away. He wished he could put down the binoculars and drive away from there. But he was glued in place. And a second later, he started to consider maybe it wasn't his body's natural reaction. Maybe something else was keeping him frozen there. The same thing that made it possible for him to hear someone else's words in his head. It came to him even clearer than his own thoughts. Stay where you are and keep looking. That wasn't his voice. Those weren't his thoughts. As impossible and terrifying as it felt, Barney had no option but to accept that the creature, which he couldn't believe could be human, had found a way to communicate with him through telepathy. The worst part was that he listened. He stood right where he was and kept looking. This meant he was awfully aware of the floating ship transforming in front of his very eyes. First, there was a set of thin wings spawning from the sides of it, accompanied by fiery red light. Next, He watched astounded as a long mechanism descended from the very center of the craft towards the road ahead of them. At this point, Barney miraculously snapped out of his daze and jumped into action. He tore binoculars off his face and threw himself back inside the car. He wasn't sure if he could trust his own thoughts anymore, if they were even his at all. But he had to try his best. "They're going to capture us," he cried out to his wife, and Betty matched his despair. He turned the car back on and tried his best to hastily drive away. He instructed Betty to keep an eye out for the object flying above them. For one indescribable moment that felt like an eternity for the Hills, that was all they did. Barney did his best to drive away, and Betty tried her hardest to keep a watchful eye for the threat looming above their heads. It was useless, though. There was only an instant's silence, and they wondered how something so gigantic could move so quietly. But then, the illusion shattered. Barney had his hand wrapped tightly on the steering wheel, and Betty was looking out of the window. Their dog was crying, and the object above them was chasing them. Then they heard the noises, a beeping sound coming from behind them. Betty turned to look, but there was nothing. But the beeping continued like rain falling on the metallic trunk of the car. Buzzing sounds hit them repeatedly, even though they couldn't see where they were coming from. Louder and louder, unsettling. It was about to drive them mad until something twisted and turned inside their bodies. A chill passed through their spines. They shivered. They felt like they might get sick or faint. It was like all the strength left their bodies. It was as easy as falling asleep. But one last wave of beeping and buzzing woke them up all at once. Did they fall asleep, though? What the hell had happened? There was the ghost of that overwhelming fear they felt, but when Barney and Betty looked at each other again, they realized everything was over. They were driving down the empty road as if nothing had happened. Could it be that nothing happened? They almost believed it. If not for the glowing red orb they noticed hovering just a feet or two above the road. Barney took a sharp turn and hit the brakes of the car. It was a roadblock. Just a roadblock. It had to be nothing other than that, and they had to get away and return home. That was all. Or was it? When they spotted the first sign on the side of the road, they confirmed their fears. They were about 35 miles south of where they thought they had been, and they had zero memories of driving down that stretch of land. When Barney and Betty finally arrived home, they believed for a second that this would be the end of it, that nothing had happened, and that nothing seriously bad had touched them on their way home. But there were many things they couldn't explain. It started as an unsettling sensation on the back of their heads, but it multiplied into an avalanche. They didn't quite feel themselves. In fact, they didn't quite look the same as they did the previous day. Betty was restless and insisted on leaving their luggage by the back door without an explanation. Barney felt strange in his body and locked himself in the bathroom to look at every inch of himself, especially his genitals, feeling insecure and worried, even though there were no visible signs that should have worried him. It wasn't just their bodies. Barney's shoes were scuffed. Betty's dress was dirty with a pink powder she'd never seen before. The strap of the binoculars was ripped. Their watches stopped working, and their dog wouldn't stop shaking and whining. One of the most concerning parts was their car. They didn't fail to spot a series of circles etched into the paint of the truck on their right where they heard those buzzing sounds when they were driving down the road. But that was it. Those unusual marks inspired them to try and remember what happened right after the relentless beeping sounds attacked their car. They had nothing. Their minds were blank. There were vague flashes, blurry memories, indescribable sensations. Absolutely nothing reliable to explain the missing period of time from their memories. There was the massive and threatening flying object. There were the humanoid figures in the windows, the lights, the sounds, and then nothing. As terrible as it sounds, this meant that Barney and Betty's story was far from over. The next steps were necessary and even bureaucratic. Barney chose to believe that if he couldn't remember what had happened to them, there must be a good reason. And if his mind didn't want that knowledge, then he was better off forgetting about it. Betty, on the other hand, got quite busy on the following days. She took care of reporting their incident with the Pease Air Force Base. She got in contact with members of the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, and she wrote letters and devoured specialized books. In a matter of weeks, their story became a serious case. There were multiple meetings and discussions. If they thought it was getting overwhelming, then they had no idea what they were getting into. That was when Betty's dreams started. Even if she had wanted to dismiss them as nothing but dreams, they were impossible to compare with anything else she had experienced before. Every single night for 5 days in a row, without mercy or explanation, she had outstanding, vivid dreams detailing the experience that her waking mind had erased from her memory. A roadblock, a forest, black eyes, blue lips, a long ramp, mumbled words, lights, scissors, and knives, a sharp needle, a starry universe ahead of her, and returning to her car. But the story remained incomplete. Somewhere along the conversations with men specializing in UFO sightings, they got the idea of trying hypnosis to try and recover the missing memories from their experience. At this point, Betty was fully immersed in the belief that they had witnessed a UFO and had an encounter with extraterrestrial beings. Barney wasn't so convinced. He wanted to forget. He wanted peace more than anything. And that was exactly what convinced him to accept the hypnosis sessions. Nothing could have prepared them for what they experienced during those sessions. They attended their sessions separately, but their experiences were very similar. One moment they were still sitting there in the doctor's office, but in the next second the walls dissolved, the floor faded. Everything around shifted and transformed into the exact scenario from that fateful day. The doctor's thoughts, questions, and guidance allowed them to travel down their missing memories and relive the most extraordinary, traumatizing, fascinating experience imaginable. It was just like Betty's dreams, a spaceship and humanoid figures, cold surfaces and unfamiliar hands, confusion, terror, relief, and at the end, trying to go back to their lives as if nothing had happened. It was impossible. Barney and Betty Hill could never return to their old lives or the people they used to be. Betty embraced and dove deeper into the community that opened up to them after sharing their tale of their experience with the world. Their story would become legendary. But it wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't something they came up with out of boredom. It was something that would follow and haunt them forever. They could pretend the story ended after the hypnosis sessions when they recovered their memories. But was that really the end? What if something happened to their dog, Delzy, that day, and it never recovered? Delzy's sudden and painful death happened not too long after the traumatic events. What if there was something else wrong with Barney? Something unexplainable and undisclosed that really caused his untimely death in 1969? Maybe their story would never end. Maybe it would stay incomplete. And it would always return to that day in 1961. Even with the hypnosis and Betty's detailed description of her dreams, most of the details were still hazy, and due to their incredible nature, they were also hard to describe and replicate. Still, Barney and Betty agreed on key elements of the story. Before I conclude this story, I just want to say thank you for choosing to watch this video, and I hope you enjoy my narration. If you are, please hit the like button, and if you don't already, subscribe to my channel. Also, I just want to give a huge shout out to my patrons Frosty Lopez, Emily B., Erin Aldrich, and Mama Tash. They were the first to sign up to my new Patreon account, and were able to get early access to the audio of this story ad-free prior to my YouTube upload. I have a starting tier of just $3 per month. So right now, I'm working on doing 2 uploads per week to this channel. Depending on the growth of this channel or support from people on Patreon, the next couple of months will determine whether I'm able to continue this as a sustainable business and do nothing but research and create awesome content for you, or just keep this as a side hustle and go back down to 1 upload every 1 or 2 weeks. Now, I hate to sound like I'm holding you ransom for content, but the only thing stopping me from focusing on this and creating the content you want me to create is whether or not I can make this a business with which I can pay the bills. So if you want to support my mission to become a full-time storyteller and content creator, please head over to Patreon and consider signing up for just the cost of 1 cup of coffee per month. Going back to the moment their car was attacked by strange buzzing sounds, they recalled being forced to stop the car. Were they in the middle of the road? Did they try to escape and drive off through the wilderness? It was useless to try to escape. The creatures inevitably caught up with them. Through the fog of time and fear, Barney and Betty remembered those humanoid figures. They weren't quite as threatening, if not for the fact that they should have been impossible. They were, without a doubt, unnatural beings, something not from this earth. That alone was enough to induce in the hills a paralyzing fear. Like lambs to the slaughter, Barney and Betty were guided through a ramp and into the monumental craft still hovering above the road. Was it cold? The hallways were long and empty, the technology too advanced and complex for Barney and Betty's mind. Did they even get a chance at studying their surrounding? They were far more preoccupied by their company. The creatures around them were below the height of average human beings. They had dark hair and eyes, but their skin was sickly pale. Worst of all, they wanted to separate the hills. Barney and Betty tried to protest, but they understood how useless it was to put up a fight when they had already lost the war the moment those beings set their sights on them. In separate rooms, Barney and Betty were studied closely by the beings that captured them. Alone, but united by their experiences, the hills recounted all types of experiments that ranged from painful needles in their stomachs to mortifying explorations of their insides, including cutting chunks of their hair and scraping their skin. The entire time, surprisingly so, there was a process of communication going on between them and their captors. Was that English? Were their lips moving? Had they mastered telepathy? Were they hallucinating some sort of speech as a last resource to find comfort in the most horrifying situation imaginable? The answers remained unclear. In fact, a lot of facts about the Hill's abduction stayed a mystery, even to the victims. In the end, all that was left was the feelings of it, the bone-chilling fear, the immeasurable confusion, the embarrassment and hopelessness. But, most of all, the tremendous relief both of them felt when they were reunited and escorted out of that spaceship and, for better or for worse, tried to close that chapter of their lives. This story was written by Danny Rahil Nieto and narrated by me, James Deverell. Thank you for watching this video. Again, if you enjoyed it, please don't forget to hit the like button, and if you don't already, subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to check out the other content I'm releasing on other platforms, such as Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. If you, or anyone else you know, has a story about anything related to high strangeness, please reach out to me with a brief description to stories@daredevil.com. I don't need you to write the whole story, so you don't need to worry about being an English major. We'll be doing all the writing. You'll just need to be willing to jump on a call with me so we can have a chat and I can get the whole story. Thanks again for watching.